pledge allegiance to the
flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Phil, try and stay out of the middle when you're there so I can... I'm doing this with the eyes. Yeah.
We're afraid the flags are going to tip over, so the guys are just going to grab them. We don't want anybody getting upset. I am Mary Portelli. I'm with the West Pittston Historical Society. And I would like to thank you all for coming out today for the inaugural First to Fall event. And this has been years in the planning. We actually started working on this in the fall of 2019. And of course COVID hit, so here we are today, and we are thrilled to have this great crowd out today to join us for this event. Our purpose of this event is just to share with the community and with others the Revolutionary War history of our community before we were West Pittston. And many people just walk down the street every day, or they drive by this cemetery, and they don't really know the historic value of it. And the purpose of our event is really to begin to share the history so that we can start to, create a respect for this historic little triangle in our town. And we hope that this will become an annual event. So if you like what you're seeing today, then hopefully next year we'll have something even bigger and better. And we hope that you'll be able to join us at that time. Our featured speakers today are going to be talking about the history of these great patriots and bringing to life what happened here. I'd just like to tell you myself a little bit about how the Historical Society became involved with this cemetery. It was in the spring of 2002, I believe it was. We had one of our members notice that the grass in the cemetery was getting a little high. It was almost Memorial Day, and we were concerned that it wasn't going to look nice for the parade. So we started to ask some questions, and we found out that the last member of the cemetery board, the board was basically down to one person. And to make matters worse, the funds were depleted. The cemetery here actually existed for 150 years off of coal royalties. They would get a nice little check from the coal companies every month, and the cemetery actually had so much money at one point, it was writing mortgages. And eventually, over time, with coal dying out in the late 50s, that money lasted actually into 2002, which is amazing. And at that point, the cemetery needed some funding, and they needed help. So the Historical Society and our membership stepped in, and they really had been supporting the cemetery for the last 20 years, and really not being able to afford much more than getting the grass cut every other week. Then, about 2 years ago, we were approached by attorney John Jenkins, who lives down near Philadelphia. He is descended from the original settlers of this area. His ancestors are buried in this cemetery. His intent was to begin an endowment fund, and he wanted to be able to preserve this cemetery and make sure that it had everything that it needed. Attorney Jenkins set up a fund through the Luzerne Foundation. The Jenkins Harding Cemetery Preservation Fund is now in full force, and it is made it possible for us to get our beautiful old 150-year-old oak trees trimmed last year. We had a gravestone preservation group come in last fall and early again this spring, working on the stones, repairing some of the broken stones, and really taking care of this place the way that it needed to be. So we are eternally grateful to Attorney Jenkins for his work. I just wanted to, I know many of you here today are ancestors of those either buried here or from the battle. Would you mind raising your hands just so we can see how many of you? Look at that. Mm-hmm. Thank you, thank you. It's good to see that. That's great to see that. Thank you for coming out. Our first speaker today worked at teaching at Wyoming Seminary for many years. He's recently retired. He was a history teacher and had local history was a big part of his curriculum. Brought to life our local history in a way that really thrilled his students and created some memories for them. And he will be speaking with you first, Clark Switzer.
Well, thank you very much, Mary. I'm going to
Bring it up. You're much taller than I am.
Clark, the microphone always comes out too if you'd like to just hold it in your hand.
try to do without that. You can all.
Yeah, that's good.
You're all good. Okay. Thank you, Mary, for your kind words and a little bit of background in the cemetery as well. It's always good to have an idea of where we were as to where we are now. So thank you to the West Pittston Historical Committee for spending so much time and effort getting us ready for today's event, and hopefully it will be the inaugural one of many to come. You know, all of our historical organizations and people who work to preserve our stories, our history, spend countless hours in research as they work to prevent or present those kinds of topics, the information, so that you and I can learn where we were at one point in time. And you who come out to support those efforts, you are so important in that as well. So thank you. And I see some young people in colonial garb. Glad to see that, and glad to see our reenactors as well, who are coming around. So our area is full of stories, as you know, that have shaped our lives, and in a few moments, Mr. Killian will be talking about one of those gripping moments that involved people buried just a few yards from where we are now. You know, here at the cemetery, we think a lot about our relatives, friends, family, and for some passers-by, as Mary noted, the stones out there are just that, stones. But to others, they are the roots of family. They are the ones that have come, including some from Connecticut. They rode or walked a long way in order to get here, where you and I are. And they were adventurous, they were courageous, and they were risk takers who, within a few years of settling here, were going to be faced with a momentous decision, a life-turning decision, as to how best to defend their homes and their land. You know, many people make plans for the future. And those of us who are a little bit older know that those plans rarely follow a straight line. Sometimes we get off on a detour, or the plans are delayed. Sometimes they're destroyed until they take another shape and we live out our lives. Now, I remember a scene from a movie, John Adams. I don't know if you've ever seen John Adams. Have you? Well, you might recall this particular scene. John Adams was not a patriot in 1774, but his cousin Sam was. And John's dream, I think I am going to take this out, John's dream that the animosity between the Americans and the British over taxes that had proven so divisive, he had hoped that that issue would be resolved peacefully. Sam was just as convinced that it was going to end in bloodshed. Now, at this point, leaving the mother country was something that was unthinkable for John. Sam was determined to bring his lawyer cousin over to the patriot cause. And in the scene, Sam and John are walking along the wharves of the city of Boston when they happen upon a customs official who was trying to board a ship. Now, he's looking for smuggled tea. And who is at the top of the gangplank? You know, that wooden walkway from the dock to the ship? At the top of that is John Hancock, who, with his tricorn hat on and his cape, is determined that that customs official would not board his ship. The customs official was just as determined to get on board and look for smuggled tea. As the tempers started to flare, Hancock shouts out, "I'm a legitimate businessman being strangled by monopoly." His dream was being crushed by the exclusive contract that the East India Company had been given by Parliament. And so they were able to sell their tea very cheap, cheaper than Hancock and others who were smuggling tea in were able to do. And so Americans had a choice to buy the cheaper tea or not. They chose not. Even it wasn't about the cost. It was about sending a message to Parliament that their taxes were not acceptable. Now, the British customs official, he accuses Hancock of being a smuggler, an accusation that could have landed Hancock in prison or worse. So Hancock denies it, says, "Watch your words, sir," then adds, "Shame," and Sam Adams adds, "Shame on you, sir." Now, in the meantime, a crowd has come around watching this spectacle, and they begin to pick up the chant and close ranks. "Shame on you, sir. Shame on you, sir. Shame on you, sir." Now, was Hancock a smuggler? Yes. Was he trying to protect his financial interest? Yes. But the coming struggle was to be much more than one over economics. It was more than no taxation without representation. 56 men of wealth decided to lay everything they had, their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor. Do you remember those words? They laid that on the line because they believed in something greater. Those 56 men of wealth, when they signed the Declaration of Independence, they became traitors. And now they were being hunted. Many saw their businesses go bankrupt. Many saw their children scattered. Many saw sons and family members killed in the coming fight. Ben Franklin was right when he said, "We must hang together, or most assuredly we will all hang separately." These protests that morphed into a revolt, that turned into a war, that evolved into a sea change of how men govern themselves, this was a revolution. And in Europe, birth determined your life's opportunities. Who your parents were, the social class that you were born into, determined your whole life. But here, on this continent, who your parents were did not determine your destiny. Here, you could make what you wanted of yourself. It was the first such social compact of men working together to rule themselves in the history of the world. Abraham Lincoln, 87 years later, described it as a government of the people, by the people, and for the people, where the people were sovereign. And though the war itself did not end or immediately change the fortunes of slaves, Native Americans, or women, it did start us on the path to the fulfillment of the ideas that Thomas Jefferson penned. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, And so 246 later, we are still in the midst of this revolution that revolves around the idea of liberty. That no one American is inherently better than any other. Now, John Hancock, the soon-to-be president of the Continental Congress, was being financially strangled. He and other colonists had been forced to pay taxes that they thought were untenable. They were unbearable. Bless you. They were unwarranted because they said Americans had fought in the French and Indian War as well. They had borne part of the cost. They had soldiered in there. And so we should not have to pay higher taxes for that, plus the fact that we're not really represented in Parliament. So when faced with the idea of pay your taxes or go out of business, see your dreams crushed, they had to weigh some options. You could submit to the British, or you could trade with the French or the Dutch or the Spanish and hope you didn't get caught because that was against the law, or you could revolt. Middle ground was hard to find. Hard choices involved weighty matters. Where are your loyalties? Are the principles life, liberty, and property, as John Locke wrote, are they just words? Or are they just too lofty and not practical enough for you to commit to the sacrifice required? Your sympathies might be with the patriots, but what about you potentially losing your farm, your crops, you going to prison, or worse? For make no mistake, going against the most powerful army and navy in the world because you want freedom, because you're tired of paying taxes, when your own country is so divided and bitterly so. You're trying to stay out of the fight just to keep the illusion of peace. Each one of those moments had their own pitfalls. Each one had their own requirements, and each one had their own benefits. If you could outlive the danger. Betrayal, being wounded or maimed, the pillage and plunder of your home, and the land, the killing, loss was going to be common. Gain depends on how you define that. That was going to be costly and elusive. Would your fellow patriots lose heart when they were confronted with the dangerous odds against them? An army that was better trained, better funded, better organized, plus they had support from people in your own country, some of whom were your neighbors. These thoughts were familiar to John Adams as he was walking with his cousin Sam. They watched the mob surround the customs official, strip him of his clothes, pour hot tar on him, dump feathers, and then tie him to a rail. When John turned to Sam and said, "Do you approve of this behavior? Sam, do you approve of this behavior?" Because what he was really asking him was, will this country be ruled by mob, or will it be ruled by law? You could disagree with paying taxes, and vehemently so. But once you cross the line into rebellion, who controls the mob? When the rule of law is ignored. Once the line is crossed, who decides who has power? These questions were asked and argued by many throughout the colonies, as well as here in our own Wyoming Valley, which becomes a microcosm of the fight for freedom. neighbor against neighbor, mayhem, revenge, murder. Here, where we are now, and near here, events unfolded that helped to push many throughout the colonies across the line of rebellion and into the hands of divine providence. The die was cast on April 19, 1775, when the British went looking for ammunition supplies and maybe to capture John Hancock and a few other leaders near Lexington, and later on near the bridge at North Concord in Massachusetts. For the next 3 years, from 75 to 78, Washington led the army and learned on the job. He knew that if the Americans could fight one day longer than the British were willing to, that the Americans would win. However, that if the Americans could hold on would be strained to the very last thread. He led an army of a country that was not united, as loyalists had joined the British. 1/3 of the population was loyal to whoever had the closest army. The British promised freedom to slaves, and thousands went to help them. And the British would gain support from tribes of the Iroquois Confederacy, the Haudenosaunee, while other tribes supported the colonists. Now, pushed out of New York, Washington crossed the Delaware, and it looked like he was finished in December of 1776. In fact, he wrote a letter to his brother saying that, "I know of no man that faces greater difficulties and less opportunities to extricate himself from them." And yet, a few days later, due to a spy by the name of John Honeyman, Washington recrosses the Delaware, smashes the Hessians at Trenton, and then follows that up with a victory at Princeton. It revived the country. But when winter came and Valley Forge came around, once again, we had rations that were almost non-existent for our army. The soldiers went unpaid, and it pushed our resolve to the very limit. Congress was not very helpful. They too were under a lot of strain. Where would the money come from? And so it was a startling moment, a turning point, when the British gentleman Johnny Burgoyne tried to split the colonies in two, marching from the St. Lawrence Seaway south to New York. And he was surprised at Saratoga, lost that, and the French came out in support of the Americans. Now, the British had started the war using a tactic of conquering all of the major cities. But now they added a new one because they saw that that was not working. The new tactic was to develop smaller units of British soldiers called Rangers. And those Rangers sometimes employed the use of Tories or Loyalists and Native Americans. And their job was to harass settlements along the frontier from New York through Pennsylvania. And so we have Cherry Valley, Mohawk Valley, and our own Wyoming Valley, who were attacked, burned, destroyed. And as many of you know, the invading force was right here, on the ground where we are now seated, here. Now the Tories, they wanted the valley back from the Yankees. The Native Americans, they wanted revenge for their loss at Fort Stanwix, and plus they wanted the white settlers out of the Longhouse in New York. And the British, they wanted to punish the rabble who was here in Wyoming Valley because of the support that they had given to Washington in men and supplies. Major John Butler led such an attack on those settlers here who had built homes, barns, mills, settled their families, looked forward to a wonderful life in Wyoming Valley. But the ensuing Battle of Wyoming and the massacre that followed strained the sensibilities of not only those who were here and experienced that, but those who were in England. The people in England, remember, they had just finished a war in 1763. Now, 15 years later, they're back on the North American continent, watching their husbands, their sons, their brothers fight again and pay more taxes. They put a lot of pressure on Parliament to stop the atrocities. Stop it. The massacre here, however, had a different flavor because it inspired the passion of those who were sympathetic to the patriot cause. So in order to preserve their dream, our ancestors decided to stand against the incursion of the enemy. And those buried here in this cemetery and in cemeteries throughout the valley and the country, their stones are testimony to the resilience and the fortitude to fight for what they held dear. They risked the very possibility of loss to hang together for the betterment of themselves, their family, and their posterity, you and me, so that liberty and justice could be had by all. Thank you for your kind attention, and I'm going to turn it back to Mary.
I'll stand on my tiptoes. That's fine. Thank you, Clark, for that informative and inspiring talk. Our second speaker of the day is attorney Stephen Killian. He is well known for his impassioned tours that he does for the Luzerne County Historical Society that take you along the route of the Battle of Wyoming, and just has been doing those for a number of years, I believe. And we are thrilled to have him here today. Attorney Killian.
Thank you, Mary. Well, I can guarantee you I will not be half as eloquent as Clark. He taught both of my children in school, and they were just thrilled. They couldn't wait for the next class because of the way he inspired them with history. He set the stage for me, so I'm going to put the events of June 30, July 4, 1778 in perspective, the context of the overall American Revolution. As Clark said, pursuant to the British strategy to suppress the rebellion in the American colonies, raids were organized on the settlements along the frontier of New York and Pennsylvania. The raids were to be made in a combination of Indians from the Iroquois Nation, American loyalists known as the Tories, who supported the British. In May 1778, Major John Butler, commander of a Tory force of Rangers, and they would be equivalent to our special forces today. They were trained for fighting in the wilderness as opposed to the regular British army that lined up in long rows and advanced shoulder to shoulder. He sent about 250 at Fort Niagara, New York, and started down toward the Susquehanna River, where he picked up 350 Seneca from the Iroquois Nation, and maybe 100 more Indians from the other tribes of the Iroquois. Two of the 6 nations of the Iroquois sided, however, with the colonists, Cayuga and the Oneidas. At this time, what was the status in the Wyoming Valley? With the Yankee-Pennamite Wars having gone on pause during the Revolution, as the colonies concentrated on obtaining our independence, the Wyoming Valley was occupied by Connecticut settlers. About 3,500 men, women, and children in the Wyoming Valley. It was contained within the county of Westmoreland, Connecticut, which had been formed in 1774 as the settlement here grew. The story of the Yankee-Pennamite Wars is a story for another day, because believe me, that would take a good portion of the afternoon to explain the nuances of the fight between Pennsylvania and Connecticut over the Wyoming Valley. The settlement extended from the Lackawanna Valley down to roughly the Chickasha area. The townships were laid out. On the east side of the river, you had Hanover extending all the way to Pittston, with Wilkes-Barre in the middle. And on the west side, you had Plymouth Township and Kingston Township and Exeter Township. With the outbreak of the Revolution, the Continental Congress levied on each of the colonies for troops for the Continental Army. In Connecticut, they based the levy of their quota on each of the counties. In Westmoreland County, the first and second independent companies were recruited from the young men who were living here at the time, commanded by Captain Samuel Ransom and Captain Robert Durkee, respectively. At that time, most of the armed forces in the colonies consisted of the local militia, and in Westmoreland County it was designated 24th Connecticut Militia. Throughout the spring of 1778, there were rumors of these raids on the frontier circulating throughout the frontier, and particularly in the Wyoming Valley. Particularly here, there would be patrols that would go up the Susquehanna looking to see any evidence that there might be Indian raids or Ranger raids, anything that would threaten the safety of the community. In the Wyalusing, Athens Serre, which was known as Tioga Point at that period of time, there were a lot of Tories who had fled from the valley and from other parts of New York and Pennsylvania frontier when the revolution broke out to get away from the Patriots, who were the primary people here in the valley. The people in the valley also petitioned Congress to return the first and second independent companies from Washington's army. They also asked Washington to allow them to return. Because the Congress dilly-dallied, Captains Ransom and Durkee resigned their commissions and came back to help organize the defenses of the valley. General George Washington did allow Lieutenant Colonel Zebulon Butler, no relation to Major John Butler, to return to Wilkes-Barre to organize the militia for defense. Congress, as it's wont to do, to feel like it was doing something, authorized the creation of a third independent company in the Wyoming Valley. That company was to remain here for defense. It was a nice gesture on paper, but the way to man that company was to take men from the other militia companies already within the valley, so it did not increase the defensive power here in the Wyoming Valley in the summer of 1778. As the raiding party moved south, they picked up a few more Tories at Tioga Point and Wyalusing, and on the night of June 29, 1778, encamped at the mouth of Bowman's Creek, just south of Tunkhannock. In the morning of June 30, Stephen Harding Jr., Benjamin Stukely Harding, John Gardner, and a boy named Roger Hatzels, went to work at their cornfields several miles above West Pittston. As they were finishing their labor, a Tory who was known in the valley came to one of the group that was standing guard and said, "I'll stand guard while you go and get the horses." As they came back with the horses, all of a sudden they were ambushed by Indians who had come down the river. Benjamin and Stukely were killed. John Gardner was taken captive. Stephen Harding Jr. and the young man escaped to warn the south. Moving downstream about 3/4 of a mile, the Indians also captured James Hadsel Sr., Daniel Carr, his son-in-law, and a black servant of William Martin named Quacko, who were working at the Hadsel Tan Yard along Sutton Creek. The captives were taken to an area near Orange that evening where James Hadsel Sr. and Quacko were tortured and killed that night. At the same time, James Hadsel Jr. and his brother John, along with their brother-in-law Ebenezer Reynolds and Daniel Wallen, had returned from working fields on an island in the river. As they landed, the Indians attacked, killing James Jr. And although wounded, Ebenezer was able to escape with Mr. Wallen and John Hanson. Learning of the approach of the raiders, the settlers moved to the forts in the valley. The main fort was at Wilkes-Barre. There was a fort at Forty Fort. There was a fort at Pittston. And there was a fort in Plymouth called the Shawnee Fort. But there also were blockhouses in Hanover Township and Plains Township, and probably a couple of other locations where the settlers could flee for safety in the event of attack. On July 1, Colonel Dennison led a party of the militia up to the site of the Harding and Hadsell massacres to recover the bodies and bring them back for burial. In the meantime, and I'll refer to him as British Butler so we can make the distinction between John Butler and Zebulon Butler, moved his force out onto what is known today as Mount Lookout, where he could look out over the entire valley. The Wintermute family, who lived in Exeter, roughly at the corner of Valley Street and Susquehanna Avenue today, were known or suspected of having Tory sympathies, and they had stockaded a little stockade around their farms called Wintermute's Fort. When the militia were called to the forts, the Exeter Company divided itself between Wintermute's Fort and John Jenkins' Fort, who had done the same stockade around his fort, farmhouse, not too far up here on the corner of the Jenkins Bridge on Susquehanna Avenue. One of the Wintermutes went up to Mount Lookout and invited British Butler to make his headquarters at the Wintermute farm. When Butler reached the farm, they opened the gates, took possession, and the part of the Exeter Company there was captured. Butler then sent a force up to Jenkins Fort demanding its surrender, and being tremendously outmanned, they surrendered, and so was the part of the Exeter Company that was at Jenkins Fort. An emissary was then sent from the British down to Forty Fort to demand from Colonel Dennison the surrender of Forty Fort and all the other forts in the valley, including the blockhouses. Excuse me, Dennison refused and called all of the militia companies to assemble at Forty Fort. Colonel Dennison turned over command to Lieutenant Colonel Zebulon Butler. It was known that General Washington had released the 1st and 2nd companies finally, and they were on their relief to the valley under command of Captain Spaulding, and that they probably would arrive in a day or two, maybe by July the 5th or so. As the Indians destroyed the settlers' farms and crops, a heated debate took place among the militia leaders of Forty Fort. Colonel Dennison and Colonel Butler, they wanted to wait. They advised waiting for the arrival of the relief column, and also because it was well known that Indians did not like to attack fortifications. They liked open in the field, hand-to-hand combat. However, shortly after noon on July 3rd, led by Captain Lazarus Stewart of the Hanover Company and those in favor to attack prevailed. And of 350 to 375 members of the militia marched out of Forty Fort to the St. Patrick's Day in the morning to attack. They stopped first at what was known as the Stone Bridge, which was over Abram Creek, and they established a battle line on the lower bank, which was higher, hoping that the British would attack them across the creek to this high ground. They were there for several hours, but the British did not take the bait, and the debate again raged, should they move forward. British Butler, in the meantime, set the Wintermute farmhouse on fire, giving the impression that he was evacuating the valley and was burning everything. And again, it was, we must go out to save our property. So the militia marched up the Great Road toward the British position at the Wintermute Fort. When the column reached an area of Abrams Plain, about present-day 4th Street and Susquehanna Avenue in Wyoming, it was met by a British skirmish line. According to Charles Minor, Abrams Plain was dotted with yellow pitch pine oak shrubs. The column halted. Lieutenant Colonel Butler addressed the men, as was common in those days. Quote, "Men, yonder is the enemy. The fate of the Hardings tells us what to expect if we are defeated. We come out to fight, not only for liberty, but for life itself. And what is dearer, to preserve our homes from conflagration, Our women and children from the tomahawk. Stand firm the first shot, and the Indians will give way, every man to his duty. At that point, the column filed off to its left into line of battle. They placed the right flank on the edge of the bank that leads down to the flats to the river. Colonel Butler, Major John Garrett, and Captain Robert Durkee took command of the three right companies, the right wing of the militia, which included the 3rd Independent Company under Captain Bedford Hewitt, the Lower Wilkes-Barre Company under Captain James Fidlack Jr., and the Upper Wilkes-Barre Company under Captain Resing Deer. Colonel Dennison and Lieutenant Colonel George Dortz and Captain Samuel Ransom took charge of the 3 left flank companies, being the Hanover Company under Captain Lazarus Stewart, Kingston Company under Captain Oholiab Black, and Plymouth Company and part of the Huntington Company, which was coming up from the Shinshinee area, had been able to reach where it was attached to the Plymouth Company under Captain Asa Whittlesey. Colonel Dennison also spoke to the men, saying, quote, "Be firm, everything depends on resisting the first shock," unquote. Once in line of battle, the militia started to advance. Unbeknown then, the militia was being drawn into a trap set by Major British Butler, because the retreating skirmishers were bringing them closer and closer to the British main battle line. You also have to, if you go up Susquehanna Avenue, keeping their right flank on the bank over the flats, the topography meanders, and as they moved forward, the right company started to shift toward their left, or the state going over the bank. That caused the left companies to be crowded. They stopped. And once the right companies got situated again and started moving forward, the left companies moved forward, but it created a gap of about 25 yards in the center of the militia's line. Shortly before 5 o'clock, the militia advancing about a mile in this battle line, they found the Rangers, the Tories, in line of battle behind a stone and log fence on the opposite side of about a 6 or 7 acre field that would have been spawned. In this area, the British had posted Indians on either side, either end of its line, some over the bank, leaving the flats, but the majority were in what was known as a morass or a swamp on the left flank of the militia. Lieutenant Daniel Gore was wounded in the left arm near the river, the bank to lead to the river, and he said to Captain Durkee, "Look sharp, for the Indians are in those bushes." Durkee, for whatever reason, started to walk over to take a look and was felled by Indian fire. In line of battle, the militia fired a volley, reloaded, advanced, fired a volley, reloaded, advanced, and after the 3rd volley, advanced, and the British behind the fence had fallen back, they then began to return fire, and fire became general along the whole line. Unknown to the militia, however, the Indians which Major Butler had placed in the morass came out of the morass, charged through a lightly wooded area at the left flank of the militia line. Colonel Dennison, seeing this, ordered the Plymouth and Hanover companies, which were the immediate two companies on the other end, he wanted them to refuse their flank and let the middle companies start and fold back so that they could face the enemy coming at them. Remember, these are untrained farmers and mechanics and shopkeepers, and that was not something that they had drilled in. They have several hundred Indians whooping, charging at them, and they're trying to load their guns at the same time. They're not going to be able to step backward. The way the maneuver would be is they had to turn around and walk backward, and they certainly didn't want to turn their backs to all of these Indians. Also, in the heat of battle, with the noise, the powder, the fallback order was mistaken to be retreat. As the militia seemed to falter, Lieutenant Colonel George Dorrance on the left flank said, quote, "Stand to your work, men." And the next moment he fell with multiple wounds. The Indian attack, because they no longer were in a solid line, broke up the left flank of the militia. And it created havoc because the Indians liked that close border tomahawk attacking. As the militia, company by company, was a domino effect, one after the other, trying to fall back toward 44th and toward the riverbank to escape. As the left flank was overrun, because of the gap where the right flank was some 25 yards ahead of them, the Indians now were getting behind the three right companies. It's amazing that anybody got off of that field that day. But the Indian tactics organized them. The Rangers and Tories attacked at the same time. The militia line was overrun. Many were killed, captured on the battlefield or during their escape toward the river and the safety of 44th. The total of those killed were in excess of 200 out of the 300 and some men who marched out of 44th about 5 hours earlier. Captain Death Hewitt, commanding the farthest right company, when an officer said, "The Indians have gotten behind us, shall we retreat?" responded, "I'll be damned if I do." Drummer strike up, and trying to rally his troops, he fell where he fought. The only avenue of escape at that point was over the bank, across the flats, and toward the fields toward the river. Those who made it back to 44th were the lucky ones. On July 4, Major British Butler commanded the surrender of 44th. Colonel Butler delayed to give Colonel Dennison delayed to give Colonel Butler and other Continental soldiers an opportunity to escape the valley before surrender. The British did not consider militia to be actual combatants, so any of those captured would not have been previous prisoners of war, but any Continental soldiers would have been treated as prisoners of war. So Dennison was buying time for sending the Butler and the other Continentals to get out of the valley. The Indians spread out over the valley, looting and destroying the farms. The settlers started to flee the valley, down the river, overland, on foot through the great swamp of what became known as the Shades of Death, or back up through the Lackawanna Valley, and on the route that they followed coming down from Connecticut, which today would be mostly Route 84. Finally, on July 7th, the British evacuated the valley and returned to their base in the empty devastated valley behind them. To fully understand the impact of the defeat in the battle of the British, however, I like to put a human face on the events of July 3, 1778. These are some of the men and stories who were out at the battlefield. Darius Spafford had just married Lorena Blackman as he fought next to his brother Phineas. He received a death wound. Falling into his brother's arms, he said, "Brother, I am mortally hurt. Take care of Lavina." Anderson Dana's daughter had just married Stephen Whitney, the local schoolmaster. He and his father-in-law fell next to each other. Lieutenant Elijah Shoemaker made his escape and was in the river. As he waded into the river, a Tory named Windecker, who had been a guest at Shoemaker's house at one time, came to the bank and urged him to come back, saying, come out, you know I will protect you." With that, the guileless Shoemaker came back, and as he reached the bank, when Windecker put his left hand down to pull Shoemaker up, at the same time he took his right hand and drove his tomahawk into Shoemaker's skull and pushed him back into the river. He floated down to 44. Giles Slocum reported that he made it to Minocqua Island, where he was hiding, and he saw Henry Pencil reach the island and was hiding in the underbrush. Seeing his brother John, he threw himself at his feet because John was a Tory and begged for protection, saying, "Save my life, brother. I will go with you and serve you as long as you live if you will spare my life." John loaded his gun. Henry cried, "You won't kill your brother, will you?" To which John replied, "I will as soon as look at you. You are a damned rebel." He not only shot Henry, but he also tomahawked and scalped him. And that's known as the fratricide of Wyoming, and there is an etching from the 19th century to that effect. Sergeant Jeremiah Bigford was pursued by the Indians in the river where they were fighting. Another Indian placed a spear into his breast. His body floated away and was found a month or so later afterward, about 7 or 8 miles down the river. Captain Bidlack was captured, and he was thrown onto the burning logs of Fort Winterford, and he was held down with a pitchfork until he died. When they came back, George Palmer Ransom was able to identify his father, Captain Ransom's body by his buckles, his knee breeches, because he had been decapitated. Levius Hannum and Joseph Elliott were among the group of captives who escaped while they were waiting the fate of other captives in the hands of Queen Esther. Queen Esther Montour was traveling into the and she placed 16 or 18 of the captives one at a time around a rock with her head on the rock as she danced and smashed their skulls with a ball, which was a round stick with a ball tied together. Today it's known as the Bloody Rock of Queen Esther's Rock. If anybody is interested, there's a historical marker on 8th Street. 60-year-old William Searles and 14-year-old Atherton Buck were fleeing, and they heard a cry, "Stop, you shall have port, or we won't hurt you." Searles turned and saw Buck stop, where he was immediately tomahawked. So Searles kept running and escaped. Rufus Bennett was fleeing toward 44th, holding on to the tail of Colonel Zebulon Butler's horse. When as he reached the stone bridge, he was about to be overrun by pursuing Indians. Seeing Richard Inman lying on the ground, some say he was just waking from the effects of consuming too much courage while they were in line of battle at the Raven's Creek. Bennett asked if Inman's gun was loaded, but he said it was. Bennett asked him to shoot the Indians. Inman shot the leading pursuer, and the other Indians fled. The wounded Lieutenant Gore hid in the rushes along the riverbank until he could make good his escape in the darkness. He fared better than his swine. At nightfall, his brothers Asa, Silas, and George, and his brothers-in-law Timothy Pierce and John Murphy lay dead on the field. Only Daniel and his brother Samuel survived. Matthias Hollenbach escaped by stripping his clothes and swimming across the river to reach the raising the disaster to Wilkesboro Fort. Captain Blanchard, who was with the Pittston Company guarding the Pittston Fort, reported seeing fires along the river across from Pittston, by which light he could see captives being tortured and burned at the stake. Colonel Dennison reported that 268 privates, 1 colonel, 2 majors, 7 captains, 13 lieutenants, and 11 ensigns were killed in battle or died by torture afterward, including every company captain, Lieutenant Colonel Dorrance, and Major Garrett. And Clark has indicated in his talk there was far-reaching ramifications than just what happened here in the valley. The Battle of Massacre, Wyoming, was the direct impetus for General Washington to send General Sullivan in 1779 into New York to destroy the Iroquois nation and make them wards of the British at Fort Niagara. But it also encouraged the anti-war party, the Whigs in Parliament, to press for the end of the war. So we not only had local events and significance for the people living here, but we also had an impact on the revolution, whether we knew it or not, because of the results of Sullivan's march, encouraging the anti-war party, the British Parliament. In October of 1778, a party came back from Connecticut, went to the battlefield, and they gathered as many of the bodies as they could find. And they buried them in a mass grave along Wyoming Avenue, and from a postcard that I saw years ago, in the neighborhood across from St. Cecilia's Church. There's a Dunkin' Donut place there, or a donut shop. I think it might be in that area. In the 1820s, a group of men, knowing where the grave was, decided if they didn't do something about it, the site would be lost. So they dug up the bones and they stored them in trunks in a store. And they hoped that the states of Connecticut and Pennsylvania would provide the money to put up a monument. Neither state was interested in it. So they raised some money, but the project languished. Fisher Gay gave a 5-acre plot to the Wyoming Ladies Monumental Association. on which the final room could be raised. They, through a series of dances and dinners, etc., finally raised the money for the erection of the Wyoming Monument. And there's a crypt in the basement where the bones that they have managed to secure from the battlefield are buried. I'm going to put on my hat as Secretary of the Wyoming Commemorative Association and invite you all on Monday morning at 10 o'clock to the Wyoming Monument, where we will do the 144th annual commemorative service for the 244th anniversary of the Battle of Massacre of Wyoming. The band will start from 10 to 10:30. Our speaker this year is a professor from Penn State who's going to talk about Benjamin Franklin and the Wyoming Battle. So I hope to see you all there. It's free and open to the public. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve and Clark. At this point, I'm going to give a brief close. First off, I just want to say, to reiterate our WPHS president, Mary Portelli, it's hard to believe that the foundations of this event were put in place over 2 years ago, and we're finally able to get to this point. Based on everything we've seen, I think it's fair to say it was worth the wait. To that end, there are a number of people who I'd like to thank for their support. First, our speakers. I've been privileged to work with both Clark and Steve on a number of local historical projects, and I kid Steve, he knows so much about the Battle of Wyoming because he was there. But no, it's been very privileged. Thank you for being here to give a lot of substance to this event. Basically, I'd also at this point like to recognize our First to Fall committee, who have met quite a bit over the last 2 years, in some cases in the teeth of inclement weather. Mary Portelli, who, as I said, her work with the society has been invaluable. Truly a great president for our board. Judy Aida, and if you don't mind, raise your hand so we can see you. Judy, she did the program work here. Tom Overzit, who's sitting back there in the corner, he's one of our PR liaisons. Thank you, Tom. And Bill Rowe, who is on the camera back there, has been a great source of input to this. I'd also like to recognize our West Pittston Historical Society Board of Directors, all of whom were a tremendous help here. And if you don't mind, raise your hand. Cheryl Butera, Ellen Quinn, Ruth Melberger, Mary Portelli, Judy Aida, Judy Stevenson, Bonnie Baird, Sherry Emersall, Bill Rowe, John Kearns, and Tom Overzit. Okay.
Thank you for being.
Continuing, I would also like to thank the following partners and donors who have been very generous to this event through their time and resources. West Pittston Tomorrow, who's kind of partnered with us on this. Dion Fernandez, the Times leader. Joyce Insurance Group, Big Top Rentals, Independent Graphics, Gary's Supermarkets, Koharchik Construction, and of course the Melberger family for use of this lot here. Thank you very much. And also there's a donor who wished to remain anonymous, so I'm going to leave it at that. I would also like to acknowledge, as Mary has, John Jenkins, Esquire, okay, whose endowment has been critical in maintaining the cemetery where the First to Fall lie. It's fitting that the descendants of one of West Pittston's first residents, and whose stockade home, also known as Fort Jenkins, served as a place for refuge for the Harding family, and continues to see that their sacrifice and perseverance are not forgotten. Thank you. While West Pittston may have been chartered in 1857, her roots were planted with the tenacity and perseverance of early Americans like John Jenkins. West Pittston was, in fact, cemented when Colonel Nathan Dennison led a recovery party to retrieve the badly mutilated bodies of the Hardings before having them interred in the sacred ground behind me. To anyone who has raised or has made a home in the Garden Village, or in the Valley for that matter, know that your memories, especially the happiest, would not have been possible were it not for patriots like those we affectionately remember as the First to Fall. Let the First to Fall remind us that no tyrant or tyrants whether they be 3,300 or 30 miles away, can take the most treasured virtues we have from God, namely liberty and freedom. The first to fall is something we expect to do every year, and anybody that knows me, I love anything that is annual. We hope to see all of you and many more next year. And also, as Steve noted, if you have not done so already, please make your way to the Battle of Wyoming commemoration at the Wyoming Monument on July 4th at 10 a.m., where the remains of close to 300 lie, deserving the same honor and remembrance of the first to fall behind me. In closing, God bless the souls of our first to fall and all patriots who have given their life in the ultimate sacrifice and defense of freedom and liberty. May God bless the Garden Village of West Pittston and the Wyoming Valley, and may God please bless the United States of America. Thank you very much. At this point, I'd like you to now accompany me over to the cemetery where the 24th Infantry, the regiment, will be doing an honorary burial to the first to fall. Thank you again for coming, and enjoy the rest of the afternoon.